Hi, I'm Rochelle, and welcome to me screaming into the void, mostly about books. The Reading Guy has created a tag called the snob-o-meter, and some of you might have seen some other YouTubers talk about their sort of feelings around this tag. And considering that a lot of what I do with my reading, both in regard to classics, in regard to global literature, taking romance and creating an analytical project out of it, I did feel like it would be interesting to actually talk a bit about whether or not, or in what degree, I would be considered a literary snob. So there are 12 questions, but the last one being tag some people. If you want to do this, you are now tagged. Go forth and just send me a link so I know that you've done it. So it's interesting to see what other people are talking about when it comes to snobbery. So 11 proper questions, and we'll go on with the first one, which is, what is your definition of book snobbery? And just this question made me interested in sort of doing this tag, because I had to then start to think, well, what do I think about book snobbery? And I think there is actually two ways that we can talk about this. One is the cultural systematic view of high and low art, where books are a form of that, and the other is more the interpersonal. So what do I mean with high and low art? I want to introduce you to John Story and his book, Inventing Popular Culture. He has done a cultural history analysis of what is pop culture. When you talk about pop music or popular books or popular anything, what are we then talking about? And what I really enjoyed is that he sort of talks about a lot of different ways of understanding what popular culture can be. So, for example, one of the points he's talking about is popular culture as a form of folk culture. So, folk music, folk dance, things that are created by the populace would be then considered a form of popular culture. Then he has popular culture as mass culture. So popular culture as what is popular. And then he talks, of course, about popular culture as the other of high culture. And this is probably what people think about when we are talking about snobbery within high and low literature. That there are certain books that are considered good literature and others that are considered lowbrow literature or popular literature. Then we have popular culture as an arena of hegemony, as postmodern, roots for cultural identity, mass art, which is again goes back to what is not just created by the masses or created or what is enjoyed by the masses, but also what is designed for the masses as something that is pop culture, that something is designed to have broad appeal to the populace, and of course then considering sort of easy art or literature, and of course popular culture in form of global culture, that literature, art, culture, books are no longer something that happens just within a nation's culture, but is something that is spread online. So book talk is a very good example of both mass literature, but also global literature. Books talked about on book talk will be more popular that people would want to read. And because more people want to read it, more people will then talk about it. So they sort of end up with a form of self-confirming spiral about what is the books that we should or shouldn't read. So in this sense, if you're sort of looking at it as sort of in the social structures of it, snobbery would, of course, be the opposite of that. So snobbery is when you are looking at things that are created for the populace, created and enjoyed by the populace. And I'm using the word populace as in population or mass population here, and thinking, well, you shouldn't really enjoy that because it's not really high art in that sense. And yeah, on one hand, I don't really care what other people read. On the other hand, what I enjoy reading, what I read most, will probably be more geared towards the high end of literature, what others would say is high end of the literature. So that is sort of the social structural way of understanding where snobbery comes in regard to literature. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is, of course, an understanding of the interpersonal aspect. That snobbery is about, I feel that what you are reading isn't the proper thing to read. And what I want to do in that sort of understanding of snobbery is that complicate it, that rather than having it set in stone in social aspects, then what is proper and not, as we find in sort of the more systematic understanding as presented by John Story, the interpersonal is very much individual. That what I would consider proper or good literature, right literature, won't necessarily be what other people concede as the proper or right literature. That when I sort of talking about books in translation, global literature, people sort of think, oh, here she goes again. She's not really a part of us. She isn't interested in us. Because what's the proper literature is, of course, what everyone else is reading within our subculture. So there are so many ways of talking about what we can talk about when it comes to book snobbery. But that is sort of the two categories that I would talk about when it comes to what is book snobbery. Question 2. Is there a genre or type of book you would never consider reading, such as would you never read a romance, or if you regularly read romance, would you ever try a science fiction novel? And this is what I mean with how book snobbery can work on an interpersonal level, that you can sort of have, these are the proper books to read. That is something different than sort of social cultural aspects of it. Personally, I try to read very diversely. And when I'm talking about diversely, I don't just mean gender or sexuality or country or language. I also mean genre and types of books. There's a reason why I have made an X amount of videos going into the romance genre to try to understand what is the romance books. Even if I ended up that project thinking that, well, most romance books aren't probably my cup of tea, at least I now understand why I'm not enjoying them. So I try to read everything. But of course, there are certain limitations in that. I don't want to read pseudoscience books. I don't want to read books that I consider harmful either to myself or to others, at least generally. Of course, here you can also have caveats because there are always examples of exceptions, but mostly it's not the genres that will stop me from reading a certain book. I hope. Does erotica count as literature? And this is another one why I was so interested in doing this tag. Because what is literature? What is art? And I'm not saying this to be a pain in the neck. I'm genuinely asking you. There is, within the philosophical traditions, you find something, or a tradition within philosophy, that is called aesthetics. And aesthetics is the tradition within philosophy, or the topics within philosophy that deal with art. What is art? Why would one thing be considered art and something not? And I had somewhat of an introduction to this through theatre. I studied theatre when I went to my upper secondary education. And one of the things that my teacher did first day of school, this sort of my introduction to all of it, was that she got one of my classmates to sit in the middle of the classroom and eat an apple. And then she asked us, is this art? And we had to discuss it. And there are a lot of ways you can absolutely argue one way or the other for what is art or what isn't. And a part of art has always been about trying to redefine what will be considered art or not. And again, literature is here a subset of art. Poetry, for example, and plays. Are they literature? Personally, the way I've sort of dealt with all of this is that I view art, again, art with a sort of the big word here, as a form of communication. That what separates art from non-art, someone who is sitting there eating an apple and someone doing a performance, an art piece, sitting there eating an apple, is that one is communication and one isn't. So one is trying to say something, and that can be directly or trying to elicit a set of feelings or thoughts in whoever is viewing or reading or listening to that piece of art. That doesn't mean that all art is good. That doesn't mean that we can't have a very interesting conversation about what then is communication, when is something then communication, and of course, art as a craftsmanship. If art is communication, then you can have good communication and bad communication. And of course, communication in the sense of, do I then, as the artist, decide what a piece of art can or cannot be? But within this understanding of art as communication, yes, I do think that erotica would then be considered literature, because they are trying to elicit an emotion, to communicate something. But we can have so many good and interesting discussions about that. Question 4. Is it better to read classic books than popular bestsellers? No. It's not better to read classics than bestsellers, but it's not better to read bestsellers than classics. What is best to read is what will make you lead a reflective life, to understand what is going on, not just around you, but inside you. Some classic books might help you in that journey, and some popular bestsellers might help you on that journey. And some classics might be, well, not as helpful, and the same with popular bestsellers. One isn't better than the other, except for your specific journey. Have you ever bragged, question 5, have you ever bragged about reading a classic in order to sound smart? There are so many good questions in this tag, and I have no idea how long this video is. Sort of, yeah, I just read this and this book will make anyone think you're smart, because usually name-dropping books out of the blue makes you look smug. But we communicate what type of books we read all the time through our environment and through our possessions. And here I am probably guilty of trying to flag to everyone what type of books I read. Partly because I want to sort of see if anyone else is interested in the same books I'm reading. But also, when I met my husband, when we were first, or even before we were dating, we were colleagues and sort of hanged out with one another until everyone else understood that we were dating. And then we admitted that we were probably most likely now dating. We visited each other to just watch films, discuss, eat dinner before going out, sort of stuff like that. And the first thing my, now husband did at this time, when he came to my apartment, was checking out my bookshelf. And the first thing I did when I came to his place was checking out his bookshelf, with his first response being that I've just moved, so a lot of my books are still in storage. Flagging very clearly that I understand that you are now checking out my bookshelf to see if we are a match, and this is not all of my books. We were very clearly, without necessarily thinking about it, because we were attracted to each other without admitting to ourselves that we were attracted to each other, trying to impress one another with the books that we were having, because reading is such an important act for both of us. The books that you present in your bookshelf is a way of promoting your reading taste, is a way of, well, bragging. So, no, I have not bragged directly about reading a classic, but I have bragged about reading diversely, reading classics, having Shakespeare as one of my favorite authors, because when the potential partner came along, I did want to make him think that I was intelligent and therefore worthy of his attention. Yeah, he was fooled. Number 6. Do audiobooks count as reading? Yes. What about comic books and graphic novels? Yes. Audiobooks the same as a sort of a physical book. It's the same story. It's the same type of information. And you can see that if you, for example, ever read plays, because then you sort of see how different plays will communicate from, for example, a book. And also in regard to, for example, if you're listening to an audio play, radio theatre, which is a very different way of communicating than someone reading an audiobook. Same thing with comic books and graphic novels. I mean, they use a very different set of communicative skills and a way of communication because they also use pictures. But yeah, that also counts as reading. Because in the sense of reading as taking in a story and absorbing communication. Number 7. Have you ever looked down at someone for reading popular fluff book? A book with little substance to it. For example, self-help book or a celebrity memoir. Yes and no. And what I mean with that is I think that everyone is on their personal journey. And the important thing with reading, to me, is not what you read, but how you read. That you read with intent, that you read trying to push yourself, that you read trying to understand the world more, that you read intently. And what you read isn't that important as long as everything else is in line. And sometimes you can actually learn more about yourself by reading fluff than reading a new classic book, because you've read so many classic books that they don't really challenge you anymore. But on the other hand, there are certain books that, as I stated, pseudoscience books that are harmful. They're not really fluff that sense, but there are certain books that, especially the pseudoscience books, I realize, wow, that, yeah, oof, not a good look, sadly. But to me, the fluff, a book being a fluff, has more to do with if you are engaging with the book or not, if the book is challenging you or not. But what something means with being challenging can be very, very different things. And I thought that reading the 50 romance books that I did for my romance project were in some ways much more challenging because it was a completely new way of reading than reading Shakespeare's historical plays, because I know Shakespeare. I know how to read him, how to understand his way of communicating and what he was trying to do with this project. So one man's fluff is another man's mountain. So, number 8. Have you ever been the recipient of someone else's snobbery? Well, this goes back again to my first point. Are we talking about snobbery in a social structural sense? Or are we talking about snobbery as an interpersonal sense? Well, the structural sense, no, I probably have not been a victim of someone else's snobbery, because I usually read what is considered good literature. But on the interpersonal level, yeah, the whole intellectual, anti-intellectual discussion that you have on BookTube, among other things, does prove that there is a lot of snobbery from everyone when we're talking about books and literature. Nobody can be safe. So understand yourself. 9. Would you ever be friends with a snob? I don't like the idea of saying that someone is X. I don't like saying someone is kind. I don't like saying someone is mean. I don't like saying someone is intelligent. I don't like saying someone is autistic. I don't like saying someone is a snob. What I am more drawn to is the idea of saying actions can be certain categories. You can do kind actions or you can do mean actions. You can have kind intent or you can have mean intent. And in that way, I do think that we all have the possibility and all in some way have actions that would be considered snobbery on some level at certain points. Some might have more snobbish actions than others, and some might have snobbish actions in different settings. But I think that all people have the ability to have snobbish actions and snobbish intents in them, because it's all about the interpersonal level. So, yeah, I can probably be friends with someone who can do snobbish actions. I myself has done snobbish actions. You have probably done snobbish actions at some point. Are people who don't read less sophisticated than people who do? Oh, that's again such a brilliant question, because what does it mean to be sophisticated? I am tempted to talk about building. Building is a word from German, and there is so many ways to understand this term. But the way I understand it and the way I use it is that someone who is in building or has come to a place of building is someone who can balance themselves as an individual and themselves as part of a collective. So balancing those two parts is sort of the project of building. And here you can sort of see sophistication as the area that focuses on you as a part of a collective. So sophistication is here then a part of building, and sophistication is a part that I can interact with the people around me that are part of my collective. We can communicate with one another, not just with words, but with actions and with the non-verbal ways of communicating. We can take care of one another. We can acknowledge one another. And I don't necessarily think that reading in and of itself is something that makes you then sophisticated. But I do think it helps. I think that through reading, we can understand our culture's history. We can understand our culture's present. We can understand our culture's populace, culture. We can understand what we have produced. And we can also help us develop our ability to communicate, both as someone who is active communicating, but also someone who is interpreting other people's communication. So reading is a tool you can have to develop this aspect of me as a part of something larger than myself. But it's not the only tool we have. So you can absolutely be sophisticated without reading. It just, you need different tools. That can be a bit harder to get a hold of. Question 11, and so this is the last one. Measure yourself based on your answers to the previous 10 questions. Would you qualify as a book snob? Probably. I do think that from a systematic point of view, as I've already talked about, a lot of my reading would place me within high culture. There's not even a question about that. And I'm not really ashamed of that either. But on the other hand, I do try to sort of minimize my snobbish tendencies. I try to, rather than think of, oh, why do they like that, turn it around and really ask the question, well, why would someone be interested in that? So leave your links to your snob-o-meter tag and ask yourself, are you a snob? And thank you for listening to me screaming into the void.